He was a man who knew the language of fences and the weight of a winter sky, but not the soft cadence of a name spoken in the quiet of a shared room. This is not a story of a storm, but of the silence after. It is not about a rescue from the perils of the frontier, but about the slow, careful mending of two souls under one roof, where the most dangerous territory was the space between two hands, and the greatest vow was a simple promise to stay. It is the story of how a house became a home, not with the turning of a key, but with the quiet offering of a warmer cup of tea. The lamplight cast a solitary circle in the vast, encompassing quiet of the prairie. Elias Thorne sat at his kitchen table, the wood worn smooth by the methodical pressure of his own hands over the years. Outside, the world was a canvas of immense, dark space, the horizon a stark line separating Earth from a spray of distant, indifferent stars. Inside, everything had its place. The tin plates were stacked, the single cup hung from its hook, the rifle was cleaned and mounted above the hearth, its brass fittings catching the low light. His life was a testament to order, a fortress of routine built against the encroaching chaos of loneliness. The house was too silent, the air still and heavy with the absence of another's breath. He had built this homestead with his own two hands, raised its walls strong against the wind, but he had never learned how to fill the echoing space within them. He made his bed for one, the covers drawn tight, the second pillow a stark, empty square of white cotton. He ate his meals in the same chair, the one opposite remaining perpetually, achingly empty. He moved through his days with a competence that bordered on grim, his hands sure as they mended a fence line or soothed a nervous horse, but they were hands that had forgotten the shape of another's. There was a desire buried so deep within him it had almost ceased to be a feeling, hardening into a kind of moral code, a stoic acceptance of his lot. He was a protector with nothing to protect but the rigid boundaries of his own solitude. Tonight, the silence was louder than usual. A cricket's thrum from beneath the floorboards felt like an intrusion. The flicker of the lamp flame felt like a companion. He ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of stubble a familiar friction, and his gaze fell upon the neatly folded letter on the table. It was from a parson in a town 3 days' ride away, a town of dust and desperation. The letter contained a proposition, a practical arrangement born of mutual necessity, a marriage of convenience. He was a man of property in need of a wife to manage the domestic sphere, to quell the low hum of gossip that followed a solitary man. The woman, the parson had written, was in need of protection, of a respectable name to shield her from a past she wished to leave behind. He had agreed, not out of any romantic delusion, but with the same dispassionate logic he applied to buying seed. It was a transaction, a solution to a practical problem. Yet, as he sat in the waiting quiet, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within him. It was not hope, for he had long since packed that away, but a disquieting awareness of the empty chair, the unused cup, the vast, unclaimed space on the other side of his bed. The arrangement was meant to maintain order, but he felt the first tremor of its undoing, the first sign that the careful silence of his world was about to be broken. The stagecoach was due tomorrow, and with it, a stranger who would share his name, his roof, his silence. The thought did not bring comfort. It brought a strange, hollow ache, a premonition of a life he had never allowed himself to want. He rose, the chair scraping softly against the floorboards, and banked the fire for the night. The lamplight went out, plunging the room into the deep, familiar dark, but for the first time, the darkness felt less like a blanket and more like a held breath. The stagecoach arrived not with a clatter, but with a weary sigh of dust and leather. Elias stood on the porch, his shoulders set, his expression unreadable. He had dressed in a clean shirt, a concession to the occasion that felt foreign against his skin. He watched as the driver handed her down, a woman small of frame, but with a straightness to her spine that spoke of a will not easily bent. Her name was Lily. That was all he knew, besides the hushed implications in the parson's letter of a life spent in saloons, a life she was desperate to escape. She held a single worn carpet-bag, and her eyes, when they met his, were clear and direct, betraying no hint of artifice or appeal. They held a deep, quiet perceptiveness, the look of someone who had learned to read men, not by their words, but by the subtle shifts in their posture, the tension in their hands. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying no trace of the dust that coated her traveling dress. It was not a question. He gave a short, stiff nod. "Ma'am." The word felt clumsy in his mouth. He was a man of few words, and none of them were suited to this. He took her bag, his knuckles brushing hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of awareness through him, a sudden, sharp consciousness of her presence. He led her inside. The house, which had always felt like a simple extension of himself, suddenly seemed stark and unwelcoming through her eyes. The single cup, the empty chair, the palpable lack of any feminine touch. It was a shelter, not a home. He saw the way her gaze swept the room, taking in the order, the cleanliness, but also the profound emptiness. She set her bonnet on the table, her movements deliberate and contained. She was not a woman who wasted motion. "The parson explained the terms," he said, his voice sounding rough in the still air. "This is a business arrangement. My name and my protection for the running of the house." He felt a fool saying it. It sounded cold, transactional, but it was the only language he had. Lily met his gaze again, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something beyond resilience. It was a deep, weary pride. "I understand, Mr. Thorne. I will earn my keep. You will have no cause for complaint." She turned, her attention already on the kitchen, on the work to be done. It was a deflection, a way of establishing her role immediately. But before she could take a step, she paused. "There is one thing," she said, her back still mostly to him. "My door. It will have a lock." He had not anticipated this. He had thought of food, of chores, of the awkwardness of sharing space. He had not considered the fundamental architecture of trust. He looked at the door to the spare room, a simple wooden barrier he had never thought to secure. He saw it now through her eyes, not as an entrance, but as a potential breach, a line she needed to draw. His silence stretched, and he felt her tense, expecting an argument, a denial of this one small piece of autonomy. But he saw it for what it was. It was not an accusation against him specifically, but a necessary shield forged from her past. It was a boundary, and he, a man of fences and clear lines, understood boundaries. "I'll fetch the tools," he said, his voice quiet. The surprise in her posture was minute, a barely perceptible relaxing of her shoulders, but he saw it. It was the first, tentative cornerstone of an unspoken agreement. He would not be a threat. He went to his workshop, the scent of sawdust and oil a familiar comfort. He found a simple slide bolt, its brass mechanism clean and functional. He returned to find her standing exactly where he had left her, as if she feared moving further into his space without permission. He knelt before the door to what would be her room, the tools laid out beside him. He did not speak, focusing on the task. The rasp of the file, the turn of the screw, the solid click as the bolt slid home. Each sound was a word in a new language they were just beginning to learn. He tested it, a firm, satisfying thud. He stood and stepped back, leaving the door open. He had not crossed its threshold. He would not unless invited. He had given her a lock, a piece of metal and wood, but it was more than that. It was a promise. A gesture of respect that cost him nothing and gave her everything she needed to feel safe under his roof. Lily looked from the lock to his face. Her expression was still guarded, but the hard shield in her eyes had softened, just a fraction. A silent acknowledgment passed between them. The arrangement had begun. The days that followed fell into a quiet, careful rhythm, a silent negotiation of space and presence. Elias rose before dawn, as he always had, but now the scent of coffee, weak and bitter the first day, stronger and richer the next, met him as he entered the kitchen. Lily was already there, moving with a quiet efficiency that respected the morning's stillness. She never spoke unless necessary, her presence a soft hum against the backdrop of his solitary life. He would find his work shirt, a button missing the night before, resting on his chair, the button sewn neatly in place with small, precise stitches. He said nothing, but he wore the shirt, the feel of the thread a small, persistent reminder of her care. He, in turn, began to leave a pail of fresh, cool water from the deepest part of the well, just outside her door each morning. He never saw her retrieve it, but the empty pail was always there when he returned in the evening. It was a conversation held in gestures, a language of quiet service. He learned the sound of her footsteps, the soft brush of her skirt against the floorboards, the way she hummed, almost inaudibly, when she kneaded bread. These sounds began to weave themselves into the fabric of his home, filling the empty spaces he hadn't known were there. One afternoon, he came in from the fields, his hands caked with dirt. She was at the table, a book open before her, her finger tracing the words with a slow, halting movement. He saw the frustration tighten her brow. He washed his hands at the basin, the silence stretching between them. "I can teach you," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. She looked up, her pride a visible shield. "I have no need of it." "A body has need of things they don't ask for," he replied, his voice softer this time. He dried his hands and sat in the chair opposite her, not too close. He simply looked at the page. "That word is harvest." She stared at him, her gaze searching his for any hint of pity or condescension. She found none. There was only a quiet, steady offering. Hesitantly, she pushed the book across the table. "And this one?" Their lessons became a part of the evening ritual. The lamp would be lit, casting their two heads, bent over the book, in a shared circle of light. His large, calloused finger would point to a word, and her smaller, quicker one would follow. He never rushed her, never showed impatience. He simply gave her the words, one by one, like placing stones to build a path. In return, she began to read his needs. She saw the way he favored his left shoulder after a long day of chopping wood and started leaving a hot compress near the fire for him. She noticed he drank his tea black and strong, and his cup was always poured first, the steam rising in a silent offering. One evening, as a cool wind rattled the window panes, he returned to find a heavy quilt he hadn't seen before draped over the back of his chair. It was a patchwork of old fabrics, but the stitching was impeccable, the patterns creating a surprising beauty from discarded scraps. He ran his hand over it, the texture warm and solid beneath his palm. "It gets cold in here at night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she stirred a pot on the stove. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the competent housekeeper or the wary survivor, but the woman who had mended his shirt, learned his habits, and now offered him warmth. His guardedness, the stoic wall he had built around his heart, felt the first definitive shift. It was not a breach, but a quiet, willing erosion. The longing he had buried for so long began to stir, a quiet ache that was no longer for a hypothetical presence, but for the specific woman who stood across the room from him, her face softened by the firelight. He pulled the quilt around his shoulders. It smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, of her. "Thank you, Lily," he said, speaking her name for the first time. The sound of it in the small room was intimate, a note struck that lingered in the air long after it was spoken. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips. It was a small, fragile thing, but it lit her face, and his heart, with a warmth the fire could not match. The careful dance of their cohabitation continued, the space between them shrinking not in feet and inches, but in the currency of shared glances and anticipated needs. The house, once a bastion of his solitude, now held a delicate, shared atmosphere. He found himself scanning the room not for threats, as he was wont to do, but for her. He would watch her hands as she worked, the deft, sure movements as she peeled a potato or threaded a needle. He admired their competence, their grace. He felt an urge, sharp and unfamiliar, to reach out, to cover one of her hands with his own, simply to feel its warmth, its life. But he always resisted. Touch, he knew instinctively, was a boundary he could not cross without an invitation. He had offered her a lock. He would not now force a door of a different kind. Lily, in turn, grew more attuned to him. She could read the weariness in the set of his shoulders, the frustration in the clench of his jaw. She learned that the silence that followed a difficult day with the livestock was a silence that needed to be left undisturbed, while the silence that followed a letter from back east was one that could be gently nudged by the offer of a fresh cup of coffee. She began to leave a single wildflower in a jar on the kitchen table each day, a small splash of color against the drab wood. It was an offering of beauty, a quiet insistence that this house could be more than just a functional shelter. One evening, a sudden summer rainstorm broke, the wind lashing against the windows and the thunder rolling across the prairie like a great empty wagon. The sound was deafening, violent. Elias looked up from his book to see Lily standing stock-still by the hearth, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale. Every rumble of thunder made her flinch, a tremor running through her small frame. He saw the terror in her eyes, a raw, unguarded fear that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with storms from her past. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, so as not to startle her further. He did not approach her, but instead went to the window, pulling the heavy curtains closed, muffling the sound and shutting out the sight of the thrashing rain. He lit another lamp, and then another, filling the small room with a warm, steady glow that pushed back against the encroaching dark. He moved back to the table and sat, picking up his book, though his eyes did not see the words. He was simply creating a pocket of calm, a quiet anchor in the midst of a tempest. "It's just noise, Lily," he said, his voice low and even. "The walls are strong. You are safe here." The last three words were a vow, spoken as plainly as if he were stating the color of the sky. "You are safe here." She did not respond, but after a long moment, the rigidity in her posture eased. She slowly came back to the table and sat down, though her hands were still trembling. She picked up a piece of mending, but her fingers fumbled with the needle. Without a word, he reached across the table and gently took the fabric from her hands. His touch was brief, a light brush of his calloused fingertips against hers, but it was intentional. He set the mending aside. "Just sit," he said. "The storm will pass." And so they sat in the warm lamplight, listening to the fury of the storm spend itself outside. He did not press her for explanations, did not ask about the fear in her eyes. He simply shared the silence with her, a solid, unwavering presence. When the thunder finally faded to a distant grumble, and the rain softened to a gentle patter on the roof, she finally looked at him. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, heart-wrenching vulnerability. "Thank you," she whispered. He simply nodded. The careful distance he had maintained, the wall of propriety and caution, felt impossibly thin. The longing he felt was no longer a vague ache. It had a name, a face, a pair of hands that trembled during a storm. It was the yearning to be the man who could make her feel safe, not just from the world, but from the ghosts that haunted her. He wanted to offer more than a locked door and a sturdy roof. He wanted to offer the shelter of his own heart. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she would have to be the one to open that door. The chill of autumn began to creep into the bones of the house. The nights grew longer, the wind whispering of the coming cold. Elias took to building up the fire before he retired for the evening, ensuring a bed of hot coals would last until morning, a silent act of care directed at the woman sleeping in the next room. They had settled into a routine so comfortable it was almost familial, yet an invisible line still existed between them, a boundary of unspoken feelings and hesitant trust. The spare room, with its locked door, was a testament to both the safety he provided and the distance that remained. One evening, after a particularly grueling day spent winter-proofing the barn, Elias came inside to find the main room colder than usual. A fierce draught was seeping from beneath the front door. Lily was huddled by the fire, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her mending forgotten in her lap. He saw her shiver. Without a word, he knelt by the door, his fingers tracing the gap where the wood had warped. He spent the next hour working, not on the door, but on a solution. He took a scrap of heavy canvas and filled it with sand, sewing the ends shut with thick, sturdy stitches. He laid the draft stopper at the base of the door, and the room immediately felt warmer, the silence more settled. He looked up to find Lily watching him, an unreadable expression on her face. Later that night, as he was about to bid her good night, a formality that had become their ritual, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Thorne, Elias." The use of his given name was a significant shift, a deliberate step across a line. He turned, his heart giving a slow, heavy beat. "The nights are getting colder," she said, not looking at him, but at the fire. "My room, it does not hold the heat well. The hearth is in here." It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact, but underneath it lay a question, a tentative, courageous offering. He understood what she was not saying. The main room, with its large stone fireplace, was the warmest place in the house. It was also where his bed was, tucked into the far corner. She was speaking of proximity, of shared warmth, of a practical solution that was deeply, terrifyingly intimate. The choice was his. He could have offered her more blankets, could have suggested she move her mattress closer to her own door. But he knew this was more than about the cold. It was a test, a moment of profound trust. He thought of his large, sturdy bed, a space he had occupied alone for so long. He thought of her, small and shivering on the other side of a thin wall. His protective instinct, the core of his very being, warred with a lifetime of solitude. "There is room," he said, his voice husky. "By the fire. You would be warmer." He did not say, "in my bed." He offered a space, not a demand. The invitation hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. Lily finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting his. He saw no fear, only a steady resolve. She was the survivor, the one who initiated moments of trust on her own terms. "Only for warmth," she stated, her voice clear. It was her boundary, her condition. "And you will not. You will ask. Before touching." The unfinished sentence was as clear as a vow. He gave a single solemn nod. "I will ask." It was a promise made in the flickering firelight, more binding than any legal contract. "Your word, Elias. My word, Lily." She retrieved her pillow and a single blanket from her room. She did not use the lock. She left the door ajar. She made a space for herself on the far side of the bed, a careful distance between them, and lay down, her back to him. Elias remained by the fire for a long time, the heat doing little to quell the tremor in his own hands. This was the midpoint, the turning of a page, a mutual, explicitly consensual choice to deepen their closeness. He finally moved to the bed, easing his weight onto the mattress so as not to disturb her. He lay on his back, staring up at the dark ceiling, acutely aware of her presence, of the sound of her soft breathing just a few feet away. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the quiet, powerful intimacy of two lonely souls, choosing to share the warmth, not just from the fire, but from each other. The news of their arrangement, a marriage in name only, had been a quiet ripple in the nearby town. But ripples have a way of spreading, and soon they reached the ears of Silas Croft. Croft was a man who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned, and he had long considered the Thorne homestead a property he would one day acquire by whatever means necessary. He viewed Lily as just another asset attached to the land, a woman with a sullied past he could easily intimidate or purchase. He began to appear at the homestead with unnerving regularity, his presence an oily stain on the clean prairie air. He would arrive on his fine horse, dressed in clothes too clean for the country, a predatory smile fixed on his face. He ignored Elias, his eyes always on Lily, his words dripping with a foul, possessive familiarity. "A flower like you shouldn't be wilting out here in the dust, little bird," he'd say, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands, in a way that made Elias's own hands clench into fists. Elias always positioned himself between them, a silent, solid wall. His responses to Croft were clipped, dismissive. He would stand, arms crossed, his posture a clear and present threat. But Croft was not a man who understood the language of quiet warnings. He only understood force and coercion. Lily, for her part, met Croft's advances with a cool, unyielding dignity. She would not be intimidated. Her spine would straighten, her chin would lift, and she would meet his gaze with a look of such profound contempt that even a man as dense as Croft would be forced to take a step back. But his persistence began to wear on the fragile peace of the homestead. His visits became a test, a constant pressure on the bond forming between Elias and Lily. One evening, after a particularly unpleasant encounter where Croft had tried to corner Lily by the well, Elias found her in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The fear she had shown during the thunderstorm was back, but this time it was mixed with a simmering rage. "He will not stop," she said, her voice tight. Elias came to stand beside her, not touching, but his presence was a comforting weight in the room. "He will not have reason to step on this land again," Elias said, his voice a low growl. It was a promise of violence, a language she understood far better than that of courtship or tenderness. But Lily shook her head. "No, that is what he wants, to provoke you, to have you thrown in jail for assault so he can take this place." Her perception, her understanding of the predator's mind, was sharp and clear. She was a survivor. She knew how men like Croft operated. That night, the tension lingered in the air. They sat by the fire, the space in the bed between them feeling both vast and minuscule. The shared warmth was no longer just for comfort. It was a silent pact against the coldness of the world outside their door. "He said things," Lily began, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the flames, "about my past. Things he thinks give him a right." Elias's jaw tightened. He wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that her past was her own. But he knew words were not enough. He waited, letting the silence be her invitation. "I worked in a saloon in Abilene," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "My father sold my indenture to the owner when I was 16. I did what I had to do to survive. I bought my freedom. I came here to be clean of it." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his for the judgment, the disgust she had seen in the eyes of so many others. Elias met her gaze. He saw not a broken saloon girl, as Croft had called her, but a woman of incredible strength, a woman who had fought for her own soul and won. His heart, a thing he had long considered dormant, ached with a profound, protective tenderness. He reached out then, slowly, his hand open, palm up on the blanket between them. It was a question, an offering. He did not move closer, did not try to touch her. He just offered his hand, a silent anchor. After a long moment, she tentatively placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his, a fragile trust. The contact was electric, a current of unspoken understanding, of shared history and future promise. "This is your home now, Lily," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "No one will ever make you feel unsafe here again. That is my vow." The confession, the shared touch, the simple, heartfelt vow. It was an emotional door swinging open, flooding the quiet room with a light more powerful than any lamp. They were no longer just two people sharing a roof. They were partners, bound not by a legal document, but by a shared past of survival and a burgeoning hope for a future. Silas Croft was not a man to be deterred by locked doors or silent warnings. He arrived a few days later, not alone, but with the town sheriff, a man whose loyalty was easily bought. Croft carried a sheaf of papers, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He had found a loophole, a claim on the water rights to the creek that fed Elias's land, a claim based on a forged document and a paid witness. It was a legal maneuver designed to ruin Elias, to force him off the land so Croft could sweep in and take everything, including Lily. They stood on the porch, the sheriff looking uncomfortable, Croft looking like a vulture who had finally found his meal. "It's a simple matter, Thorne," Croft said, waving the papers. "The magistrate will see it my way. You'll be ruined by spring. Of course, I'm a reasonable man. Sign the deed over to me now, for a fraction of its worth, and I'll even give the girl here a position in my new household." The insult was deliberate, a final twist of the knife. Elias stood perfectly still, his face a mask of stone, but Lily could see the fury coiling in his muscles, the dangerous light in his eyes. This was the moment she had warned him about, the provocation. But before Elias could speak, before his rage could give Croft the victory he craved, Lily stepped forward. She moved to stand not behind Elias, but beside him, her shoulder brushing his. She looked not at the sheriff, not at the papers, but directly into Silas Croft's eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried the clear, cutting authority of absolute conviction. "This is my home," she said, "and this is my husband." The words, "my husband," were not spoken with the resignation of a woman trapped in a convenient arrangement. They were spoken with the fierce, unwavering pride of a woman who had made her choice. It was a declaration, a claim. Croft's smug expression faltered. He had expected to deal with the stoic, solitary rancher. He had not expected this united front, this woman who refused to be seen as a victim or a prize. "He can't protect you from this girl," Croft sneered, trying to regain his footing. "His name won't be worth the dirt on his boots when I'm through with him." "His name is not what protects me," Lily replied, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch. "His character does. And that is something you know nothing about." In that moment, something shifted between Elias and Lily. It was a silent, powerful confirmation. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to fight. She was fighting for them, with a courage that humbled him. He slowly, deliberately, reached down and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in full view of the other men. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of partnership. His thumb stroked the back of her hand in a small, steadying circle. It was a wordless signal. "I am with you. We are together in this." He then turned his gaze to the sheriff, a man he had known for years. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply spoke the plain truth. "Sheriff, you know what kind of man I am, and you know what kind of man he is. You can stand there with him and his forged papers, or you can uphold the actual law. But if you let him take one more step onto my property, you will have to arrest me, because I will protect my wife and my home." The words "my wife" echoed Lily's "my husband." They were simple vows, spoken not before a preacher, but before their enemy. The air crackled with tension. The sheriff looked from Croft's sneering face to the united, unyielding couple before him. He saw the truth in Elias's eyes, the strength in Lily's. He saw a partnership forged in something far stronger than paper and ink. He cleared his throat, his decision made. "This is a civil matter, Croft. Take it to the magistrate. For now, you'll leave this property." Croft's face contorted with rage, but he saw he had lost. He had tried to break them apart, and had only succeeded in forging their bond into something unbreakable. He stormed away, spitting threats over his shoulder, the sheriff following with a weary, reluctant step. The confrontation was over. No punches had been thrown, no shots fired. The victory was quiet, absolute. Elias and Lily stood on the porch, their hands still clasped, watching until the riders were out of sight. He turned to her, his gaze full of an emotion so profound it left him breathless. He saw his own devotion mirrored in her eyes. They had chosen each other. Not in a church, not with a ring, but here, on the worn wooden planks of their porch, they had become man and wife in the only way that mattered. The dust settled, and a profound quiet fell over the homestead, a quiet no longer born of loneliness, but of shared peace. The adrenaline of the confrontation ebbed away, leaving a strange, tender exhaustion in its wake. Inside, the house felt like a sanctuary. Elias led Lily to the kitchen table and gently pushed her into a chair. He saw that in her fierce defense, in the clenching of her own fists, she had driven a splinter deep into the palm of her hand from gripping the rough porch railing. He said nothing, but went to the cabinet where she kept her sewing kit. He returned with the small tin box, a bowl of warm water, and a clean cloth. He knelt before her, taking her hand in his. His touch was infinitely gentle, his large, rough fingers a stark contrast to her smaller, trembling ones. "Let me," he said, his voice a low murmur. It was not a command, but a request. She gave a small, shaky nod, her gaze never leaving his face. He carefully, methodically, washed the dirt from her palm. His movements were as precise and focused as when he was mending a piece of tack, but imbued with a reverence that made this simple act almost holy. He took the needle from her kit and, with a surgeon's steadiness, worked the splinter free. She winced, a sharp intake of breath, and his eyes immediately flew to hers, a silent question. She gave another almost imperceptible nod, telling him to continue. Once the splinter was out, he cleaned the small wound again, and then took a clean strip of linen, bandaging her palm with a careful, practiced hand. Throughout the entire process, he held her wrist, his thumb resting on her pulse point, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of her life against his skin. It was a micro-intimacy, a moment of profound connection that transcended words. When he was finished, he did not immediately let go. He held her bandaged hand, turning it over, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her inner wrist. He lifted his gaze to meet hers, and the air in the room grew thick with unspoken desire, with a longing that had been held in check for so long. The fading afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air, catching the candlelight of his jawline. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, but also the trust, the unwavering, absolute trust she had placed in him. Slowly, deliberately, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to the bandage, to the place where she had been hurt. It was a gesture of devotion, of gratitude, of a love too deep for his sparse vocabulary. He then released her hand and rose, moving to the stove. He stoked the fire, his movements economical, and began to prepare a simple meal. He sliced bread, ladled stew into 2 bowls, and set them on the table. He pulled her chair out for her, a small act of old-world courtesy that felt deeply significant. As they ate in the gathering twilight, the only sounds were the soft clink of spoons against pottery and the crackle of the fire. In the lamplight, he saw the faint trace of ink on her fingers from their lesson the night before. After they finished eating, he took her hand again, the uninjured one this time, and led her to the wash basin. He gently washed the ink from her hands, his touch careful, his focus absolute. It was an act of aftercare, of tenderness, of tending to every part of her. He was washing away the remnants of an old life, an old struggle, and claiming her, in the quietest, most honorable way he knew how. This was his love language: service, care, and the protection of her dignity. And in the warm, lamp-lit kitchen, she received it, not as payment for her work, but as the precious, freely given gift it was. The confrontation with Croft and the quiet intimacy of its aftermath had irrevocably altered the landscape of their lives. The invisible line that had once divided the room and the bed had dissolved. That night, when they retired, Lily did not move to the far edge of the mattress. She settled in the middle, and when Elias lay down, the space between them was only a hand's breadth. He lay on his back, his heart hammering against his ribs, every nerve ending aware of her proximity. He felt the warmth radiating from her, a comforting, living heat that called to the cold, lonely corners of his soul. He wanted, more than he had ever wanted anything, to turn to her, to gather her into his arms, to feel the length of her body against his. But his promise held him still. "I will ask." He lay there for what felt like an eternity, the silence humming with unspoken words. Then he felt a tentative touch. Her fingers, light as a moth's wing, brushed against the back of his hand. It was a question, an invitation. Slowly he turned his hand over, his palm open, waiting. She slipped her hand into his, her fingers lacing with his. The simple act of holding hands in the darkness of their shared bed was more intimate than any passionate embrace. He brought her hand to his chest, holding it there, over his heart, so she could feel its steady, solid beat, a beat that was now and forever for her. He finally turned his head on the pillow to look at her. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he could just make out the shape of her face, the gleam in her eyes. "Lily," he whispered, the name a prayer. She shifted, turning onto her side to face him. He felt the soft brush of her knee against his. "Elias," she answered, her voice a soft murmur that he felt more than heard. The guardrails were down. The consent was clear, signaled in the quiet language they had built together. He moved then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat. He slid his arm beneath her, drawing her closer, until her head rested in the hollow of his shoulder. She sighed, a soft, contented sound, and burrowed against him, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. He wrapped his other arm around her, holding her securely, protectively. It was not the desperate fumbling of lust, but the deep, soul-shattering relief of finding a safe harbor. He breathed in the scent of her hair, lavender and wood smoke, and felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that he had never known. They did not speak. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said was communicated in the steady rise and fall of their chests, the warmth of their shared breath, the gentle pressure of his hand on the small of her back. Desire was there, a deep humming current beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a profound tenderness, a feeling of sacredness. This was the culmination of every shared meal, every mended shirt, every quiet lesson. It was the fade to black of 1,000 small moments of care and respect coalescing into a love that was as solid and enduring as the land itself. He held her through the night, his vigilance, once directed at the horizon, now focused entirely on the precious woman in his arms. He listened to her breathing deepen into the soft, even rhythm of sleep, a sound of absolute trust. He had hired a maid, a stranger to fill the empty spaces of his house. But in the quiet darkness, holding the survivor who had chosen him, he knew it was his soul that had been healed. The seasons turned, and the rhythm of their life deepened, becoming as natural and ingrained as the rising and setting of the sun. The lock on Lily's old bedroom door rusted from disuse. The space was now a sewing room, filled with scraps of fabric and spools of thread, a testament to her creativity and a symbol of her permanent place in the home. Their days were a tapestry of shared work and quiet companionship. He would be out in the fields, and he would look back at the house, seeing the smoke curling from the chimney, and his heart would feel a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. He knew she was in there, that a meal would be waiting, that her presence would greet him at the door. It was the anchor his life had always lacked. She, in turn, found a peace she had never believed possible. The hypervigilance of the survivor began to soften, replaced by a deep sense of security. She no longer scanned rooms for threats, but for him. She learned the sound of his horse's gait, could tell his mood by the way he hung his hat on the peg by the door. Their love was expressed in the small, repeatable gestures of domestic life. He learned she loved the first wildflowers of spring, and would walk miles to bring her a small, clumsy bouquet of bluebells. She learned he was partial to apple pie, and the scent of cinnamon and baking apples became a frequent comforting presence in the house. The simple tokens of their affection were more precious than any jewel. He spent weeks carving a small, smooth bird from a piece of scrap wood, its lines simple but elegant. He left it on her pillow one night, a silent, beautiful gift. She, in turn, took one of his old, worn-out work shirts and from it stitched a new cover for the book he had used to teach her to read. It was a symbol of their shared journey, of the mending of more than just fabric. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, watching the summer heat shimmer over the plains, a traveling preacher stopped for a drink of water. He was a kind, elderly man with gentle eyes. He saw the easy companionship between them, the way Elias's hand rested on the back of Lily's chair, the way she leaned into his presence. "It's a fine thing," the preacher said, "to see a husband and wife so content in each other's company." Elias and Lily exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Their union had been declared before their enemy, consecrated in the quiet of their own home, but it had never been formalized in the eyes of the world. "Preacher," Elias said, his voice steady as he stood, and pulled Lily gently to her feet, "we would be honored if you would say a few words over us." And so, on the porch of the home they had built together, with the vast prairie as their witness, they spoke the simple, traditional vows. But the words were just an echo of the promises they had already made and kept. The real vows had been in the pouring of the warmer tea, the mending of a shirt, the sharing of a blanket. They had been in the words, "You are safe here, and I will ask." When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Elias turned to Lily. He did not kiss her with a show of performative passion. Instead, he gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, and simply rested his forehead against hers. It was a micro-intimacy, a moment of pure, unadulterated connection. They were two solitary souls who had found their family in each other. They were no longer the stoic protector and the wary survivor. They were simply Elias and Lily, a partnership as solid and rooted as the old oak tree that shaded their porch. Their future stretched before them, not as a vast, empty unknown, but as a series of shared sunrises, of quiet evenings, of a life built, stitch by stitch, with consent, care, and a deep, abiding love. The years that followed were quiet and full. The homestead, once a place of stark solitude, now echoed with the soft sounds of a shared life. They never had children of their own, but their home became a haven, a found family growing around them. They took in a young boy, the orphan son of a neighboring rancher, and raised him as their own, teaching him the value of hard work, the importance of a gentle hand, and the quiet strength of character. Their home became known throughout the territory as a place of refuge, of quiet integrity. Elias, once a man of few words, became a respected voice in the community. His counsel sought for its fairness and wisdom. Lily, the woman who had arrived with a single bag and a locked-down heart, became the heart of their home, known for her sharp mind, her quiet compassion, and her unwavering strength. Their love story was not one of grand passions or dramatic declarations, but it was written in the lines around their eyes, in the comfortable silence they shared, in the way their hands still found each other across the dinner table. One evening, many years later, they sat on the porch as they had on the day the preacher had blessed their union. Elias was older now, his hair streaked with gray, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, but his gaze, when it rested on his wife, was as tender as it had been on the first night she had shared the warmth of his bed. Lily was reading to him, her voice still clear and steady, the words flowing with an easy confidence he had gifted her so long ago. She paused, her finger marking her place, and looked out at the land, their land bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. "Do you remember," she said, her voice soft with memory, "how quiet this place was when I first arrived?" Elias reached over and took her hand, the one he had bandaged all those years ago. He brought it to his lips, a gesture that had lost none of its devotion. "I remember," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But it wasn't quiet, Lily. It was empty. You were the one who brought the music." She smiled, a full, unguarded smile that still made his heart ache with love. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a familiar, comforting weight. "We built a good life here, Elias Thorne." "We did," he emphasized, his arm going around her, holding her close. The story of their life was not in the grand events, but in the small, cumulative acts of love. It was in the shared cup of coffee at dawn, the wild flower on the table, the quilt that still lay folded at the end of their bed. Their resolution was not a dramatic ending, but a continuation of the quiet, devoted life they had chosen. Their future was in the turning of the page of the book she read, in the promise of another sunrise they would greet together. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth object. It was the wooden bird he had carved for her in their first year together, its surface now dark and polished from years of being carried, of being held. He pressed it into her palm. It was not a jewel, not a deed, but it was the symbol of his promise, a token of his enduring, quiet love. She closed her hand around it, her fingers curling over his. Their future was sealed, as it had always been, not with a flourish, but with a quiet promise, held in the warmth of their clasped hands as the last light of day faded from the endless prairie sky.